More charges in the Flint water crisis as the city decides to stick with the KWA pipeline. Can there really be bipartisan gun control legislation? And the new way to take over struggling schools, will it work? Stay put. MiWeek starts right now.
Did you know Gordon Food Service was started by a 23-year-old entrepreneur as a butter and egg delivery business more than a century ago? In 1948, school teacher Gerard Wendell Hayworth borrowed $10,000 from his parents to start a woodworking operation in his family's garage. It's now Hayworth Incorporated. These are just some of the ways Michigan's pioneers started out as small companies with big ideas.
We are business leaders for Michigan. We are committed to making Michigan a top 10 state for jobs, personal income, and a healthy economy. Funding is also provided by Delta.
Hi there and welcome to MiWeek. I'm Christy McDonald. We're so glad that you're joining us. A lot to get to with the Flint water crisis and education in Michigan, but the debate that has grabbed the nation is over gun control. Politics, policy, and procedure collided this week with an all-nighter in Congress. Both parties angry over blocked bills on gun control legislation. A bipartisan group came forward in the Senate to propose denying gun sales to people on the no-fly list and people who have mandated extra security checks before they fly. Is this yet another case of making noise and no action? Is there really such a thing as bipartisan gun control legislation? And could this finally be some kind of tipping point? There is a lot to tackle here, including how the conversation about guns plays into the presidential race. Let's bring in our MiWeek contributors, Nolan Finley of the Detroit News, Stephen Henderson of the Detroit Free Press. It's good to see you guys. How are you?
Good to see you.
All right, so I'm going to ask you, Nolan, first. What went through your mind this week as we saw everything percolating in Washington, especially what happened on the floor of the House on Wednesday with the Democrats?
Well, it's more political grandstanding and opportunism in the face of crisis at a time when we should be coming together and addressing real issues. You know, everybody's sort of grabbing up their little piece of where they think they can exploit this tragedy and shaking it in the other side's face. In the case of this bill, I mean, it should take us back that you have both Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump backing this measure. This, this is not about gun control. This is, or the Second Amendment. I mean, this is about the Fifth and Sixth Amendment and stripping people of their constitutional rights based on a highly questionable list. That no-fly list is 1.5 million names on it. There are names of largely Muslim Americans, but there are names of people, of babies on that, of people who have made phone calls to somebody who made a phone call, have no idea why they're on the list, don't know they're on the list, have no due process rights to get off the list. This is a mess. You don't want to base legislation on these lists.
So the bipartisan bill is saying, though, that there would be a process to get off that list.
Yeah. Well, then you do that. You have the due process before you start denying people their rights. You shouldn't show up at a gun store or at an airport or at your bank and find out you've lost your rights, and then your due process starts to get your rights back. That's not how the Constitution works.
You look at some of the polls, though, Stephen, and you have people, 80% of the American public say, you know what, we're fine with this. We're fine with denying the ability for people who are on this no-fly list, the ability to buy guns, and if they can then get cleared, then they can have them.
Well, I mean, it comes down to what you think is tolerable, right? Is the worst thing that could happen that somebody is denied the right to buy a gun, or is the worst thing that could happen that somebody who's not supposed to have a gun gets one and does something terrible with it? And I think the American public is pretty clear about that. Every other right in the Constitution is handled in a way that prevents, that weighs the one set of liberties against another. The liberty to not be shot in a nightclub, the liberty to not walk down the street and think somebody's going to shoot across the street at you. We don't talk enough about those liberties, and no one's saying that legal gun owners should lose their rights. They shouldn't. But if that happens in the course of trying to prevent these mass shootings, which are not legal and not covered by the Constitution, that's one thing. Now, I agree about the fly list. I mean, it's a mess. There's all kinds of crazy stuff going on there, and I think you have to fix that before you start enforcing the no gun buy on it. But we always retreat to this position where gun advocates end up saying, well, you can't do this because it won't work. What we need to talk about is, let's fix the fly list, and then let's make sure that nobody on it is getting a gun.
But let me ask you this though. But is this the issue when we're talking about gun control legislation? Is this what we should be concentrating on in terms of a no-fly list? Should we be concentrating on an assault weapon ban? Should we be concentrating on more funding going to medical research into why some of these mass shootings are happening?
What we should be looking at in this case is why. I mean, you want to talk about the no-fly list and the terror watch list. This guy wasn't on either one of them. This Omar Mateen wasn't on
them,
either
right.
one of them. Had 3 contacts, including the day he bought the guns. You had a gun owner reporting him, and that information.
And I
Instead
think
of
that's what's
grandstanding
disappointing because people talk about if you see something, say something,
Right.
and this gun shop owner saw something and said something, and they never visited it.
So instead of sitting all over Congress on an issue these folks know is going nowhere and know is problematic from a constitutional point of view, they should be examining again why our intelligence service isn't working. If you've got I'm telling you, if you've got 1.5 million people on a no-fly list and 57,000 people on the terror list and 57,000 on the no-fly list, you've got bigger problems in this country than gun measures. I mean, they need to cull that down to the true threats and then start dealing with them. And then I think you can have bipartisan agreement. But I mean, going back to the poll and the trading liberties, we know that once you start trading liberties for security, it never ends. One deprivation leads to another. You've got a right-wing group out there saying, yeah, nobody on the terror watch list should be allowed to go to a mosque or congregate with other Muslims. It's a slippery slope, and it always is.
We've always been able and had to figure out ways to balance certain sets of liberties against others. I mean, this idea that we don't do that with every other amendment is just patently false. It's just not the way it works.
We don't deny due process in any
We don't,
other
but no
amendment.
one's arguing to deny due process.
Basing this on the terror watch list would
But
do
what
that,
we're saying
Steve.
is fix the list. Fix the list.
That's
install a due process.
not in that legislation.
In the Senate bill, there is. It would fix the due process.
What it would do is
concerns.
provide a waiting list where you can go and finally get your rights back.
Look,
but you should not be on a list without being notified.
This
and
is the way
without
the Constitution works. There is no right in the Constitution that is absolute. It can be abridged for any number of reasons. They get abridged all the time. Even Justice Scalia, in a really important speech that he used to give, would talk about that there's nothing sacrosanct in the Constitution about individual rights. They are all subject to government regulation, especially when it comes to public safety.
And I think it's interesting. Go ahead, finish your
point. The only
point.
amendment that we don't have a rational conversation about where that abridgment should exist and should not is with the Second Amendment.
Which is subject to a stack of regulations that...
Like
And,
what?
okay, well, hang on one second, Noah, and something I want to throw into this conversation. It was a quote that jumped out at me that Lindsey Graham said. And he said, to my friends at the NRA, I understand your concern about denying somebody the right to buy a gun, but every right, whether speech or buying a weapon, has boundaries on it. Do you
of course,
agree with
and there
that?
are boundaries on buying a gun. There are.
I can
there
buy
are
an
a stack.
AR-15 in 15 minutes around the corner from here. So what are the limits on
You
gun
can
ownership?
if you can clear the FBI list, Steve. And and again, we're hung up then on cosmetic weaponry.
No,
instead
I'm saying it's too
you can't
easy for
buy
anyone to go buy a gun.
You can't buy an automatic weapon.
Sure, I can.
You cannot.
Why not?
Because it's illegal.
I can buy a semi-automatic weapon,
Which is
And
a
what's
lot
the
different,
difference?
about 1,000 rounds a
Right.
minute.
Enough to kill 49 people
1,000
overnight in a
rounds,
nightclub, right?
over the course of 5 hours. I've got a dozen guns in my closet that will do that.
Let me ask you this, Nolan. As a gun owner, and as
safe.
someone who's a responsible gun owner, let me ask you this: why does someone need an AR-15?
It's not about need. I mean, why do you need a lot of things you have in life? An AR-15 is no different in its lethality, its killing power, probably less so than the deer rifles I have in my gun safe.
So ultimately, what we're talking about here is what is the cost of the liberty that gun owners want to exercise, right? And that's something that we balance all the time. Is the cost of their liberty the chaos that the rest of us have to live with in a nightclub in Florida, on a street in East Detroit? You know, you've got a little girl walking around who'll be crippled for the rest of her life because she was shot just a few months ago here. At some point, we should talk about. I don't want to take your guns. If you want to have.
If you don't, Steve, then you're not going to solve the problem.
So, but this idea that any restriction will infringe your rights and not take them away from criminals is absurd.
There are a lot of restrictions, Steve, and what we're talking. My point here is we gravitate to to the feel-good solutions. We had
not
an
talking
assault
about
wep-
feel-good
We had an
solutions.
assault weapons
Yeah.
ban in this country,
And that's not what I'm talking about.
And death by the mass shootings didn't decrease. And since that ban's lifted, we've had a 36% decrease in
I'm not talking about
shootings by
assault weapons
rifle.
bans. What I'm talking
What are you
about
talking
is
about then?
addressing the nexus between legal gun sales and illegal possession. That's what goes on. None of these guns.
I don't think anybody would
hold
oppose
on.
that, Steve.
But none of these guns get stolen from manufacturers. They get sold. They get distributed to gun shops and other places, and they get sold, and then they end up in illegal hands. And there is no constitutional right for that to happen. There's no
I agree
constitutional protection for
wholeheartedly
that.
with that,
And we
Steve.
ought to be able to.
So where
I
is
agree
where is the solution then?
wholeheartedly with that.
I think.
But that's not what's on the table.
Hang on, where's the solution?
Why shouldn't guns be heavily registered? Why shouldn't gun owners have to get a license like they do in other civilized countries in order to have the gun and to use it? I mean, the idea of putting more onus on legal gun owners to make sure that their guns do not fall into the hands of criminals is perfectly reasonable and not an abridgment
Why
of their
wouldn't
rights.
gun owners want that, Nolan?
Well, I think most gun owners do, and I think most gunners are responsible and do try to keep their guns out of
So
hands.
then how do we have
But
so many weapons in
But
illegal
in
hands?
this case, again, we're changing the subject. In this case, he bought his guns legally.
Yes.
He was a guy who should have been under the FBI watch and wasn't, and he cleared the register.
But I don't think we
mean,
need
this
to.
guy-
I don't.
These were
but
not illegal
I don't
guns.
think that
No,
we
they
can
weren't.
have. Hang on. We can have the gun debate and just look back at the most recent mass shooting
look
and
at
say,
everything that
well,
goes
in this
on.
situation, this wouldn't have
Well,
happened.
look
this
at the
wouldn't
last
happen.
5 then, and find one in which in which a gun law that's on the table would have stopped them.
My question is, are we wasting time in Congress right now fighting over the no-fly list
course,
when we should be talking about gun show loopholes,
we
when
ought
we
to be
should be
talking
talking
about-
about
we ought to be talking
different
about
things?
possession.
What
What
I'm
we should
saying,
be talking about is how we address domestic terrorism and how do we keep our young men, our young citizens from being radicalized, even self-radicalized by the ISIS.
that is
organization.
part of it.
That
Yes,
was
that
the
is part of
motivator
it.
here. That's the issue here.
far
And it's a
more-
lot easier
it's
to
far more
talk about gun control
radicalization of-
and everything else than it is to hold this administration accountable for not moving against
I
ISIS.
do understand that
far more gun
I do understand that there needs to be that conversation in talking about the
is the
talking about the
conversation.
terrorism piece, but there also
not an either
but there
or.
also
The terrorism
is
piece was
how
the piece.
that intersects
In this
together.
case, in South Carolina, a year ago, it was a young white kid.
And how would you
who
have kept?
walked-
How
hold
would
on,
your gun
hold
control
on.
measures had kept the Tsarnaev brothers from making their
Listen,
pressure cooker
Listen,
bombs, Steve?
the
This is
problem,
about terrorism.
the problem is the proliferation of guns. There are 350 million guns in circulation in this country, most of them, or many of them, in illegal hands. And all of them, hold
not
on,
by a long
and
shot.
all
most.
of them sold legally. All of them sold legally at some point. So the idea that legal sales should go on as they are, even though what you have is this incredible flow of guns from legal hands to illegal hands, and we should sit back and say, well, our liberty demands that we put up with this, I think is ridiculous.
So are you saying hold
and
the gun owners
offensive.
accountable who've had their
Hold
firearms
them-
stolen?
Absolutely. I mean, if I get my car stolen today, I can't just say, oh, well, oops, no big deal. I've got to go report that to the
Of
police.
course.
There's all kinds of tracking of that vehicle, what happens to it. My license is to operate a motor vehicle is somewhat dependent on those things. There's no reason that guns should be treated differently. Your right to bear arms is
And they
not.
aren't. You have
is
you
not-
have an obligation under the law to report a stolen gun,
and
Steve.
so then why are there so many guns in illegal possession?
Because simply reporting a gun doesn't recover it, Steve.
And doesn't hold anybody responsible once some gangbanger or terrorist or whoever uses it to
who's
kill
held
somebody.
responsible if somebody uses your car to kill somebody, Steve?
If
mean, you
I don't
forfeit
report it,
your rights
if
just
I don't
because
report
it's a
it,
weapon.
my point being,
But people do report their guns stolen. Who doesn't
my
report a
favorite
gun
example
stolen?
of this is just across the Detroit River, where you have a country that is not an unarmed nation, right? Canada has gun rights. But it is really difficult to get the gun. You have to pass a test. You have to have a license, and selling guns is very restricted. So the guns, about a third of the people in Canada own guns legally, and they don't have nearly the crime that we do. Is that
Maybe
because
there are
there's
other
something
issues at
in the
work.
water on the other side of the river that's not over here? Of course not.
Perhaps it's a less violent culture.
Well, you know what? But then how about we get the money from Congress to be able to study what that gun culture is? And
Right.
that's a problem, too.
Great
So my
idea,
last
too.
question would be then everything that we saw happen in Congress this week, did the Democrats sit in for the wrong cause? Or will we finally start to see some movement because Republicans maybe don't want to go through some kind of re-election saying, I voted that I think that people on the no-fly list should have.
I wish they'd put this to a vote and let all of these civil rights Democrats vote for a measure that strips Muslim Americans of their basic rights. Yeah, I wish they'd put it to a vote.
Last word on this.
I mean, I think we are talking about this particular issue maybe overshadowing the bigger issue, which I think is a much bigger investigation into what we can do. I don't want to infringe Nolan's rights, but I also don't want to put up with what we're putting up with now. The idea that we can't do anything about that with further gun restrictions is what I'm pushing back against.
All right, we'll have to leave it there. Okay, turning now to Flint. Attorney General Bill Schuette promised there would be more charges in the Flint water crisis. This week, he delivered on that promise. Schuette sued 2 companies, accusing them of negligence and fraud for failing to properly treat the drinking water there. His investigative team determined the water company and the engineering services firm failed miserably and actually made the situation worse there. Meanwhile, Flint's mayor has decided to honor the city's commitment to join the new Regional Water Authority, KWA, but only after some changes are made to that agreement. And I think that was probably some of the most significant news that came out this week is when the mayor came out with the governor and said, well, we are going to still be in on this deal. They really didn't have much of a choice here, Nolan. But again, I start to look at the dollar signs it's going to take to make this happen.
And plus, you're fixing this city's current water system after its return to the Detroit or the Great Lakes Authority, I guess now. And now you're going to switch it again, given what they've been through previously. Man, if I were citizens up there, I would say, wait a minute, we're not going through this again, because nobody can be promised them the same thing won't happen or something similar or something worse. And this whole Karagandhi Water Authority establishment is sort of cloaked in controversy from the beginning, in terms of why it was pushed so hard and who might have benefited from this other than the people of Flint. I think it's a very risky move to go through all this to fix these pipes so they carry clean water from Detroit and then throw that out.
And then you have the EPA coming out and saying, now you have to have a secondary pipeline because we need to be able to test the water that's coming in and out. And then the price tag for that is going to be, it's going to be about $10 million. And the state says, we're going to give you 4.2. At this point, what I'm thinking, shouldn't the state be, not to say carrying the water, but shouldn't they be paying for a lot of this?
There's no question. I mean, the state's involved in the KWA. The state had to sign off on all of this stuff. For 30 years, Flint has been saying, we want to get away from Detroit water, just like all the other customers on DWSD, and for the same reasons. I mean, there's this long-standing suspicion about corruption. There is a racial component to hatred of DWSD that Flint, for a long time, I mean, Flint wasn't always a majority black city. You look back in history, they wanted out of Detroit for the same reasons. And for 30 years, the state always said, no, this doesn't make economic sense. You can't afford to build your own system based on the customers you have. And then all of a sudden,
now they can't afford to get out of it.
They said, let's go ahead. I think there's some real questions that the state needs to answer about why they did this. And if they're going to go ahead with it, they should pay. They should be paying to help Flint do this. I'm mystified that they're still going ahead. I think this is something can't survive.
They've got a gun to their head because the authorities now threatening to confiscate tens of millions of dollars of revenue from Flint to meet their obligation under the contracts they signed. If the state should be doing anything, it should be examining those contracts, examining the formation of this authority, and doing whatever it can to keep Flint from making this move.
Are we still getting any kind of revelatory facts coming out of Flint? Oh, no.
Yeah, but here's the question. If Flint doesn't go with KWA, then it has no chance, that authority has no chance to survive. I mean, they got to pay back all this money that they've borrowed to build this system. You do that with customers. If Flint's not a customer, where do you get
then who is?
the revenue?
Do you feel like we're getting a lot of the answers from the administration? We're getting that lead from the administration. There was, again, another email dump from the governor's office to the tune of 100,000 pages. And I feel like we're still getting this information.
Yeah, I mean, it's trickling out. I don't know if there was anything all that
Revelatory in
this
it.
latest batch. I expect, here and there you'll find a nugget. What Bill Schuette did this week in terms of suing these two companies and their subsidiaries, I think that's going to be an interesting case to follow. What he hopes to do is
He's looking for
damages
money
from
too,
them
yeah.
to form this sort of trust fund ongoing for Flint. I mean, I think it's going to be a really tough case, but a very interesting one.
And you have both of those companies digging in, saying, "Whoa, hey, this was not our fault."
Yeah, well, I mean, that's what else they're going to say. Otherwise, they're going to write big checks. I mean, these will be interesting cases to watch. How far does the liability extend under the law? It's something of a gamble. It's the way I read it.
Because he's accusing them both of negligence and fraud. Fraud suggests an intent.
It's intentional,
and
right?
That'll be interesting to see how he builds that case.
All right. Well, there is a new book out detailing the timeline of the Flint water crisis from Bridge Magazine, which is the bi-weekly news and analysis publication from the Center for Michigan. It's called Poison on Tap: How Government Failed Flint and the Heroes Who Fought Back. I sat down with senior editor David Zeman and reporter Chastity Pratt-Dawsey for a closer look. All right, David, we followed a lot of the in-depth reporting that Bridge has done on the Flint water crisis over the last year and a half or so, but give readers an idea of what they can expect now from this book, Poison on Tap. Is it just a collection of everything that's been written?
It's a collection of everything that's been written, but it really paints a much better, fuller portrait of all the government mismanagement that's gone on over more than a year, and it also goes a little bit beyond that, because it paints a portrait as well of the many heroes and who came together and refused to accept the word that everything was fine. And it tells their stories as well.
The entire staff contributed to this, Chastity. What were some of the things that stood out for you in terms of what needed to be inside this book to give people more context?
It's really a reference material kind of book where you look at it in a chronological way. It has the timeline from even before the switchover and up until almost to date. We're going to be updating it as well. Anyone who wants to know, okay, what happened in March of 2015, it's there. Anyone who wants to know, okay, so tell me, I want to know more about Mona Hanna-Attisha, or really what was Mark Edwards and how was he involved? It tells the chronological story in one place, and people don't have to Google all over, America to find out, okay, how did this really transpire? It's all in one book now.
And that's what I think is so great about it. And one of the things that caught me about Bridge's coverage during this entire process was the timeline. That you guys sat down and were able to start to really give detail and attribution to where all of the detail was coming from, all in one place. How important, or how, I guess, time-consuming was that, David, in terms of putting that timeline together even before it got into the book?
Yeah, it was incredibly time-consuming, but that's really our niche, which is to provide data-driven, evidence-based journalism. And, this, like so many issues, it becomes sort of a political football. On the one hand, you have folks say, well, this is what happens when you have democratically controlled cities. On the other hand, there are some people who think Governor Snyder woke up one morning and decided to poison Flint's children, and there's crazy stuff on both sides. And this really provides a really full, comprehensive context and a great research tool, as Chastity said, to really get at, all the different layers of mismanagement here.
I think it's interesting that you bring up the political debate and the politics of it all, Chastity. People say, oh, so does this come from a certain lean? Because you say, and the heroes that help the city. How would you kind of characterize the tone of this book?
I think it's just the facts. I mean, the fact of the matter is, if the people of Flint didn't stand up and demand answers, this wouldn't have happened. So yes, factually, these people are heroes. Is that opinion? Is that leaning? Some people would say yes, but I would say no. If Mark Edwards and Mona Hanna-Attisha and Leanne Walters and Melissa Mays and the Democratic Defense League in Flint hadn't stood up, this would not have been exposed, and there wouldn't be this huge, attempt to solve it. So I think it's just the facts, and it's really important to put it down, because 5 years from now, 10 years from now, people's minds get foggy, and people try to rewrite history in a way that's not fact-based. So it's really important to get this stuff down now in a way that's straight, and forward.
But it's also a great civics lesson, you know, and I don't care whether you're a Bernie Sanders supporter or a Tea Party supporter, all across the spectrum, people can read this book and look at these activists and these just ordinary residents and see, and take some pride in the fact that they wouldn't take the pat answers of government, that everything was okay when their eyes and ears and everything else were telling them that there was a real problem here.
A Poison on Tap is now on sale on Amazon. You can find it there. And for more information, just go to MiWeek.org. You know, we were going to talk about education, guys, in Michigan, but we just plain ran out of time with the entire debate over gun control. You guys will be back next week, and that's always good. So thanks. We'll see you guys then. That's going to do it for MiWeek. Thanks for joining us. Check out MiWeek.org on Facebook, Twitter. We are there during the week. I'm Christy McDonald. And for Nolan, Stephen, all of us at Detroit Public TV, we will see you next time on MiWeek. Take care.
Did you know Roush Enterprises was selected by Google to assemble a test fleet of 100 prototype self-driving cars in 2015? It also produced the new Domino's delivery cars. And speaking of Domino's, Domino's sells well over 2 million pizzas per day around the world, and half of their sales are digital. These are just some of the ways Michigan's pioneers started out as small companies with big ideas.
We are business leaders for Michigan. We are committed to making Michigan a top 10 state for jobs, personal income, and a healthy economy. Funding is also provided by Delta.